Hello, everybody in Ascent or wherever you may be watching this from. My name is Alex Mackay, and I'm a musician and sound artist. I'm currently in Norway, but when I'm not here, I'm usually in Glasgow, formerly from Inverness. And I was the Suilven artist in residence in 2019. I spent 3 periods of time in Ascent in 2019, exploring Suilven and its surroundings, and working in the fantastic artist studio in Glencanisp, which has a great view out over towards Suilven. And I was there creating sound pieces, both inspired by Suilven and its surroundings, but also using the sounds found on location themselves. And in addition to that, I spent time with both adults and children living in Ascent, sharing my experience with them, and showing them how they can record sound out in the landscape and use it in interesting ways themselves. So the original plan, in terms of wrapping up the project, was to come back to Ascent and share the finished work in some kind of performance or presentation back last year in 2020. But however, as we all know, 2020 had some very different plans of its own, and we've had to come up with an alternative way of sharing the work and bringing it to a conclusion. So I'm recording this presentation where I'll reflect a bit on my time in Ascent, and discuss the pieces that form the finished work. So you'll hear some clips of the sound pieces as we go through, but I won't be playing the pieces in full within this video. So you can either pause now and have a listen to the pieces in their entirety, or you can wait until afterwards if you prefer, after I've gone through them here, and have a listen then. So I'll just start off by introducing myself briefly for those who I didn't get to meet while I was in Ascent. In the most general terms, I'm a musician, but there are very many different constituent parts that make up my career, and I end up making a lot of different kinds of music in quite different ways. I started off in a pretty conventional way, messing around with a guitar and a keyboard as a kid, and playing in bands when I was a teenager. And as I went through school, I became more interested in more experimental ways of making music, and luckily for me, the internet had become pretty much the center of the universe in terms of music and discovering music by the time I was that age. So I was able to access loads of different music and lots of different approaches to music that I was interested in at a relatively young age, that I wouldn't have otherwise had access to through the usual channels of school music lessons and things like that. So when I was coming up to leaving school, I decided to apply to music colleges to study composition, and I ended up going to the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland in Glasgow. And one of the things I became really interested in the time leading up to that, and the time that I was there, was electroacoustic music and field recording, which basically means recording sounds out in the world that are often not considered musical in their original contexts, but creating music or some sort of sonic art from that material by manipulating the sounds, combining them with other sounds, or simply presenting them in an interesting new context. But in addition to that, I spent a lot of time writing music for other performers, and working on my own performing, usually with different kinds of electronic instruments, but also electric guitars as well. And since graduating from the conservatoire, I spent a lot of time playing with a band called Mogwai, who make mostly instrumental music, but using quite a conventional rock band kind of instrumentation. So I play live with them, and spend a lot of the last few years, prior to last year, traveling around the world with them. I'm playing gigs, but also continuing to write and record my own music. So I released an album of my own music last year, and I also collaborate with others on a lot of kind of one-off kind of projects, like film soundtracks or soundtracks for other kind of art forms like dance, visual art, or other kinds of performance and things like that. But around the time that this opportunity arose, I had been exploring ways of working with field recording that not only just captures the sound of the place, but also incorporates something of the physical environment into how the sounds are processed, and formed into pieces. So when the chance came to work at and with such a geographically distinct place like Suilven, I of course jumped at that opportunity, both for the experience of that in itself, but also the opportunity that it provided to kind of develop this way of working that had kind of arisen for me in the time leading up to that. So I spent 3 periods of time in Ascent as part of the project. And my first trip was in May of 2019. And that was primarily spent familiarizing myself with the area, meeting the people involved in the project, and the people living around about, getting a feel for the art studio, planning how I was going to work there, how I was going to approach the pieces, recording some initial ideas, and kind of just generally exploring the area on foot and on my bike as well. When it came round to July after that, it was I was returning for a bit more of a longer period of time, a few weeks, and that was the most substantial kind of chunk of time I spent there making the work. And so that time was spent out on the land around Suilven, on Suilven itself, recording, kind of collecting data of the terrain and things like that to use in the work, and and of course making the ascent up Suilven, and the experience of that is something in itself, but also it was a really unique opportunity in terms of recording. After that, that was really when the sounds were collected, and it was a matter of putting them together into the finished pieces. But I returned one more time after that main trip in July, in September, to host some workshops. So I did 3 different workshops, one with primary school children from Lochimver, another with secondary school pupils from Ullapool, and then another one with adults who live in the local area. So they were obviously 3 very different groups of people. The content and the goals of the workshops were actually mostly the same, and that was really to introduce creative approaches to recording sounds in interesting locations, and then demonstrating how these recordings can then be used in a creative way, but all using technology that is easily accessible to people for either little or no cost. Sometimes just using things you'd have anyway, such as your phone or maybe a camera or something like that. And a lot of that translated just as well to the oldest participants as it did to the youngest participants, which was really really great to see. As I've mentioned before, I use primarily electronic tools as my instruments, yet through field recording I'm able to incorporate elements of the real world, so to speak, into my work. So there's usually some sort of balance or contrast between natural and artificial elements, real and illusion. And with this project, I felt like this approach could lead to some really interesting creative approaches and produce something, some really interesting ways to engage with such a unique environment like that of Suilven. So before we get into the pieces themselves, I'm going to do a little introduction of the instruments or tools that I use to make the pieces, both while I was in Suilven and also afterwards in my studio. The first thing, and perhaps the most important thing, is this handheld recorder, which is a Zoom H5. These are very simple devices, but pretty much anyone who works with field recording will likely have something resembling one of these. And as you can see at the top, there are these two microphones pointing in two different directions. And what this does is, the reason there's two microphones positioned like this is to capture the sound in stereo. So when you hear the recorded sound played back, it will be spatialized according to where the sounds were coming from when you recorded them. So if I record something with this and a sound is happening to my left, when you play that sound back, you'll hear it as if it's coming from the left-hand side of wherever your speakers are placed, or as if it's coming from towards your left ear if you're using headphones. But it's also possible to connect additional different microphones to this recorder. And another microphone that I used in this work is called a hydrophone. And as you might be able to work out from the name, it's a microphone that's able to capture sound underwater. There's only one of these, unlike with the normal microphone on the recorder, so you don't get the same stereo spatialization as the usual microphone, but nonetheless it's quite a remarkable experience to hear sound underwater in this way, because these microphones work a bit differently to normal ones, and they work quite differently to how the human ear works. They're essentially what we call contact microphones, which are very sensitive microphones that usually pick up sound as vibrations moving through a solid object. So if you put a contact microphone on a table, it would pick up whatever sound is moving through the surface. So if you had your mobile phone placed on that surface and it vibrated, you'd hear that vibration quite clearly in the contact microphone. However, because these hydrophones are sealed with a kind of rubbery material, it means they're waterproof, but they can still conduct the vibrations through the microphone inside, which means when you put it underwater, you can hear the sound as it moves through the water. So the vast majority of the sounds that you hear in these pieces originated in the recordings I made using that quite basic recording setup. But there were some additional sound sources that I used as well. And there were two different synthesizers that I used. They were very different instruments, and they were used in quite different ways. But all the pieces feature one or both of them to some degree, sometimes very subtly, and then sometimes in much more prominent ways. And the first one I don't have with me because it just happened to be sitting in the studio in Assen, was a very dusty Korg Poly 61 synthesizer, which is basically just this early digital synthesizer that was made in the mid 1980s. And I'm always excited to get stuck into old bits of equipment like that and see what I can get out of it. But this was quite a particularly exciting surprise, and not something I would have expected to come across in a wooden hut out in Assen. So I picked it up and plugged it in, turned it on, and lo and behold, it powered up and managed to get some sounds out of it. However, there were quite a lot of things that were not quite working as they should. So there was buttons that weren't working, some of the keys weren't making any sound, but I felt compelled to use this particular instrument despite its quite distinct sound in comparison to the field recordings, as to me it kind of became part of that place as I spent time there. And I'd found it there, I didn't bring it, I didn't put it there, it was just there when I arrived, and it had these kind of idiosyncrasies about it that were unique to that particular instrument, and were probably the result of the condition it had developed over the years wherever it had been. So although I was pressing the keys and the buttons to generate the sounds, because of the kind of defects it had, it could only produce a kind of set range of sounds and tonalities that were really just determined by the condition of the instrument and what worked and what didn't. So I spent a good number of hours playing around with it, seeing what I could get out of it, recording everything, trying trying all the combinations of settings and notes that I could kind of get out of it. And then in the studio later, I edited all the material into smaller chunks that I can then assemble into the pieces. The other synthesizer is this box with all the wires going in and out. And this is known as a modular synthesizer. And put simply, what a modular synthesizer is essentially all the components and constituent parts you would find inside a conventional synthesizer, like the Korg one I was just speaking about, are there, but they're all in separate parts and accessible to the user to connect up in a multitude of different ways in order to produce different kinds of sounds. So it can produce sounds just on its own, or you can connect it to a computer or another piece of hardware to play it or control it, or you can feed other sounds into it to manipulate them. And I think I used it in pretty much all of those ways in these pieces. And I really enjoy using them because it gives you a bit more autonomy over the actual sounds themselves, and how you kind of construct the sound is very much kind of from the ground up, as opposed to using kind of presets that have already been designed for you. And so you can really kind of customize your sounds, but in a way that's kind of much deeper than the kind of normal synthesizer. And even with just a kind of small box setup like this, you can find modular synthesizer setups, that like cases that take up entire walls and looks like a kind of something out of a sci-fi film. But I quite like just having a kind of small portable setup that I can take around with me, but still kind of get lots of different results out of. Finally, I'll just say a little bit about the computer software I used. One program that I use quite often was used pretty substantially in this work is called Max MSP, and it's a bit hard to describe exactly what it does because it's such an expansive program in terms of what it can do, and it can get very complex. But essentially what it does, and what I use it for, is to take one kind of data and turn it into another kind of data that electronic musical instruments can understand. Therefore you can kind of generate some really interesting musical results that you can't really get from more conventional ways of playing the instruments. In this specific work, I used it to make graphs that plot the data of the terrain in the Suilven area, and then the shapes of the terrain can be output as data that controls the modular synthesizer. So different parameters of the synthesizer, pitch or volume for example, can follow the shape of the terrain. So for each of the pieces I had data from a different cross-section of the landscape being sent to the synthesizer, and by connecting the different parts of the synthesizer with the patch cables, I could control how this data manipulates the sound. Then the other program I use is Ableton Live, and this is a pretty standard piece of software that's very widely used across the music industry as what's called a digital audio workstation, which basically means you can use it to play, record and mix music on the computer, and I use it in pretty much everything I work on. There's a few different digital audio workstations that you could probably call industry standard. But I prefer this particular one as the interface is geared a bit more towards live performance, so it's really good for playing around with sounds and experimenting in different ways prior to recording them, and then kind of committing to the final version. So this is what I used to edit and process all of the sounds I recorded, as well as the synthesized material, and then compose the pieces with all those sounds and mix it into its final form. So those were the tools I used to make the work, and as you can see, it's quite a compact setup. So I was able to take all of this minus the synthesizer with me on the buses from Glasgow up to Lochinver and back. I could use it in the studio there, and then go back and continue working on the same equipment and the same setup, wherever I was, and maintain that same workflow. as well as making the pieces, as I mentioned before, I was also teaching a few workshops while in Ascent, and what we were working with were essentially the same core tools of a handheld recording device and a digital audio workstation. So, of course, each workshop was modulated slightly according to the age group of the participants, but the core ideas and activities we were working with were broadly the same. We would go out onto the land between the studio and Suilven, and I would demonstrate how to use a handheld recorder, and with the aid of a few other recording devices, we would split up and explore the landscape, being led by our ears and capturing what we were drawn to. And then we'd find a body of water, and I would demonstrate the hydrophone, and everybody would get to hear the hydrophone, and that was really exciting. So then we'd head back to the studio, and we'd review the sounds we recorded, have a listen to them, and talk about them a bit, and then explore how we could play with them in Ableton Live, and start to build a soundscape from the material we recorded together. I thought that maybe the idea of standing outside and in an open landscape and trying to listen in new ways might be particularly challenging for some of the younger pupils to get on board with, but they really took to it quite quickly, and began engaging with the surroundings in their own individual ways, discovering kind of new things that they'd never noticed before, simply by opening their ears and listening, actively listening, and then when they got the chance to take some creative agency for themselves through using the recorders and recording what they were perceiving, that proved to be really exciting as well. And a particularly great memory I have of that experience is when together we experimented with the hydrophone in the loch just outside the studio in Glencanisp, and they all took turns having a listen to what they could hear underwater through the hydrophone, and just listening to this little loch and perceiving it in a completely new way, and how excited they were by that, and how it sparked their imagination, and how they were responding, and what it was kind of conjuring up in their imaginations was really fantastic, and it felt really great to facilitate that experience for them. But that reaction wasn't really just exclusive to the younger primary school kids. There were similar responses right through the older secondary school pupils and the adults as well. Just that experience of experiencing something familiar in a completely new way, and seeing those responses transcend the age brackets was really rewarding, and can reinforce my belief in what makes this kind of work really special and the potential it has. So this first piece to me is kind of a sonic portrait of what it's like starting out on the paths towards Suilven from Glencanisp. These sounds were mostly recorded standing or walking along these paths, with water flowing through the burns after a pretty heavy downpour of rain. But by using multiple recordings taken from different perspectives, I was able to develop the senses of depth and texture throughout the piece. I've just opened up the tracks containing the field recordings, and we've got 3 different tracks here, and we can hear them. That's one of them. We can hear a second one that comes in, has a bit more detail of the water, and then a third one contains a bit more wind and kind of movement in the sound. So by layering these 3 sounds together, over the course of the few minutes of this piece, we can start building a kind of bigger, wider sonic picture of what the sound is along those paths. Now this is where the ideas of what's real and what's illusion begin to blur in the world of field recording, and you can play to different extents with how precisely faithful to the original recordings you want to keep it. But you can see here just a simple layering of sounds without doing too much to them can create a kind of more musical direction in a way, just by layering different sounds together. So we're not really making them sound like anything else, or you, as a listener, you still hear it as those sounds of the winds and the water, but we're able to kind of shape it into a more musical structure. Now, as well as the field recordings, both of the synthesizers that I mentioned are used in this piece, and the modular synthesizer with all the wires coming in and out, I recorded a few tracks, 3 different tracks of sound here that you can hear. And then we have this second layer that comes in underneath, a more droning layer, and then a third layer which is just a kind of doubling of the first sound to create a bit more depth and texture. And then when we add in the recordings, you can hear how they sit alongside each other. As you can see here, how these sounds are used to structure the piece are quite similar to how we structured the recordings that we just went through. So we've got 3 tracks of each building in at similar points to a kind of a peak towards the end here. The old synthesizer that I found in the studio is quite prominent here too. The process of adding this in was a little less tied to the conceptual underpinning of the piece, but I found that these kind of slightly oscillating sounds that you can hear here lended themselves quite well to the flowing water and the movement in the wind. But then, as you'll hear here, if we go back to track as a whole, we have these chords that come in now. And I really like these chords that I recorded, and I found that they provided quite a nice structural direction to the piece, as we have these kind of flowing, subtly moving sounds, to have some more definite sounds coming in and out to create another layer of direction and movement in the piece. So as the piece goes on, we can see more layers of chords being built in here. So the spaces between the chords stay more or less the same, but as we go on, we have a broader range of pitches, and then building to the end. These very wide chords with kind of low and high pitches built in. So after putting these together, on reflection, it kind of I felt a connection. How I structured those sounds reminds me of the experience of standing on those paths and walking those paths, and the experience of listening. And as you go on, you hear, although they're the same sounds, you hear more detail, and you become aware of a broader range of sounds. And I like how the building of the chords as well as the building of the recorded sounds reflect that. So this second piece is, in a way, a kind of antithesis to the first one, where that was focused on distance, subtle change, and evolution of texture. This is a lot more close up, dynamic, and features quite a different approach to field recording. The first piece uses sounds that very much capture the human ear's perception of that soundscape, whereas with this piece, the recordings capture sounds in a way that would be nearly impossible to hear with your own ears. So the piece is quite clearly in two parts, showing two different perspectives. The first being from the perspective of above water, and the second being from underwater. But both explore the sonic qualities of water in different ways. In the first half, the recordings are mainly from fast flowing water above the surface. So you can hear here. And again, similar to the last piece, we're building with several different recordings of a similar thing that we can build up to kind of build the intensity. And here, towards the end of this half, we're kind of at the most kind of saturated texture. And how I recorded these sounds was basically using the handheld recorder as close to the surface as possible without risking water damage or anything like that, which I did both by hand and by attaching the rope and lowering it from a bridge. So this was capturing the sound of the water in a way that the ear couldn't really, or at least couldn't without kind of risking some injury. So while we're hearing the same burns and bodies of water that we're hearing in the first piece, we're hearing them from a very different perspective, which is a bit more different from the more kind of realist approach of the first piece. So I've also used quite a lot of the synthesizer recordings in this piece as well, but this time I used kind of some of the more kind of abrasive and kind of volatile sounds. We have this sound, which is quite active, quite fast-paced. And then alongside that, some chords, similar to how we layered the chords in the first piece. Adding a broader range of pitches, swelling in there. And building to a peak. And then the modular synthesizer as well. These kind of rising and falling sounds that are in the context of the rest of the piece you don't hear so prominently, but they're there adding another layer of movement. So this piece continues the thread of water from the previous two pieces, but this time focusing on the small lochs around Suilven rather than the flowing burns, and again with a different approach to recording and the composition of the sounds. So similar to the previous piece, this uses recordings from both above and below the surface of the water, but this time layered simultaneously, so giving a kind of expanded sonic picture of the water in a way that you can never experience with your own ears. So if we just have a listen to some of these recordings here, we've got 5 layers of recordings from the water, 2 from below and 3 from above. So in the early stages of the piece, you can hear the rain intensifying. Mostly from the above water recording that we're hearing here, but also from under that we can hear here. And you can hear those raindrops hitting the surface there. So as you might be noticing now, the perception of motion is quite a common feature of my work, whether it's captured in the recordings themselves or through the composition of those recordings and the processing of them. So in this piece, there's 2 kind of ideas of a sense of motion and change that occur through the piece. And the first comes from the recordings and how they're layered. So if we just listen to the recordings again, isolated at the beginning of the piece here, it's quite light. And then as we progress, we're layering more recordings on top of each other. And then getting to the middle here, our most kind of intense point, we've got 5 different layers of sound at once. And then as the piece moves to the end, it becomes lighter and less dense again. So this is edited together from several different recordings. So the rain shower didn't happen exactly in real time as we hear in the piece, but that kind of sensation of change in motion is created through the editing and layering of the different recordings together. Again, not really doing anything much in terms of manipulating the sound itself, but just kind of choosing how the sounds are combined rather than changing the sounds themselves. Now the second evolution of sound and a creation of a sense of change in motion comes from the processing of the sounds as well. So when I say processing, it essentially means using effects in this software to alter the sound in some way. And in this case, the most distinctive processing is the use of resonators on the rain sounds. And you hear this start to happen from about halfway through the piece. You hear the kind of chiming sounds. Now, these resonators are, if we isolate them, now they're responding to the sound of the raindrops. So, and it kind of behaves a bit like a virtual physical instrument in a way, like maybe a string instrument or a percussion instrument, basically any kind of instrument that's played by striking something. So when a sound comes into the effect, the volume of that sound strikes the kind of virtual resonator, which produces this kind of electronic resonance. So in this case, if you imagine the loch on which the rain is falling as a giant drum or glockenspiel or something like that, every drop of water hitting the surface causes that surface to resonate and create a pitched sound. So as the piece gradually progresses, the balance between the real sound of the water hitting the lock and the electronic resonance shifts a bit towards this more electronic resonance. Then finally, in this piece, we have more of the synthesizers as well. Um, Now they play a bit less of a prominent role in the piece, as we're focusing mostly on the rain sounds and the resonance they cause. So they're there in a bit more of a background role, kind of intended to complement the slow evolution of the texture. So as you can see here, we've got a few layers of different chords from the synthesizer. So if we just isolate those, kind of move in and out slowly over the course of the piece, different pitches. So it's quite a similar timbre and sound throughout the piece from the synthesizer, but just slowly evolving pitches. And then with the modular synthesizer, there's a few different clips of sounds. So water has featured pretty prominently in all three of the prior pieces, which is really a reflection of the land around Suilven and the networks of rivers and lochs that make up that landscape. But the drastic change in the terrain as you move up Suilven obviously means it's very different on the slopes and at the top, and that is reflected in the soundscape as well. So if this piece actually, there's no layering of field recordings on this piece. There's just one recording that's just been edited for length that we can hear here. So what we hear is it's a less dynamic soundscape. It's drier, it's lighter, it's not so dense in texture, and that's because the prominent sound on top of Suilven on a clear and dry day like it was when I went up, as you can hear here, is the sound of the wind moving through the grass and the reeds. So in contrast to the previous pieces, which utilize and focus on those kind of perceptions of motion quite heavily, I felt that this piece needed to take quite a different approach because of that difference in the soundscape, and respond to the relative stillness that's found both in the sounds, but also just that how the environment is at the top of Suilven. And as a result, as you can see here, the piece is constructed from quite a lot less material than the pieces prior, and so what we have is, as I said before, just one recording, and then 4 layers of synthesizer recordings. And also, unlike the previous pieces, there's more of an even balance between the recorded and the synthesized material in this piece. So rather than the synthesized material playing a kind of more background supporting role, it's really quite prominent in this piece. So the synthesized sounds here all come from the modular synthesizer, and I chose to keep the sounds very dry and restrained, choosing just a simple process to modulate the sounds without much effects or intricate layering here. So there's simply 4 different notes that you can see on the tracks here, and there's not much in the way of dynamic changes or anything. The 4 notes simply come in at roughly the same level and stay there, and then the different rates of pulsing create these different interlocking patterns and changing kind of sonic friction between the sounds. So we can hear first tone, second tone, then the third tone is coming in now, and then finally a fourth. So when we put them together, you get these different interlocking patterns. And then the only processing of these sounds that really happens is as the piece goes on, a higher harmonizing note is added on top of each one. So that essentially just multiplies the different harmonic combinations that are existing and interacting with one another. As you can hear, the higher notes coming in here. Now obviously the timbral qualities of these sounds are quite different from the grass recordings, but the construction of these synthesized sounds was actually quite directly inspired by those recordings. So the sound of the grass and the reeds is the result of the blades moving and brushing against one another. So that's where I had the idea of having these individual kind of strands of sound. They're all slightly moving in a similar way, but at kind of different rates, brushing up against each other. So rather than the synthesized sounds being designed kind of explicitly to complement the field recording, they're kind of standing kind of side by side as two separate kind of sound worlds, but all kind of generated from the same kind of conceptual idea in the beginning. So this final piece is perhaps, I would say, the most expansive and freeform of the collection. We start off at an almost kind of microscopic level in terms of the sound. I used a hydrophone to collect sound from inside the kind of mossy surface at the top of Suilven. So even though it's not water, the hydrophone can still function as a kind of contact microphone, which gives you the ability to pick up the sound of very small movements within that kind of layer of moss covering the ground. So we can hear the very first sound in the piece. You can hear those crackles of tiny bits of movement. And then as we move outwards from this point, we're adding in the normal microphone. So to a more human ear-like perception of the sound at the summit, with the light winds, and hear that a fly or a bee just flew past. So we have quite a few layers of different recordings, all being kind of layered throughout the piece. Kind of going from this very small area of focus onto a much wider soundscape, taken from different points from the summit of Suilven going downwards. So there's actually no synthesized sounds in this piece. All the additional sounds you hear are processed versions of the recordings. But I did actually use the modular synthesizer to process some of these sounds. So the sound didn't originate in the oscillators in the synthesizer that normally generate the sound. I just took the sounds from the recording and fed it through the system. And one of the first additional sounds you hear is simply just the recording of the wind, but processed through the synthesizer, and you can see how there's several layers here on top of each other. So this is just a recording of the wind, but fed through a filter on the synthesizer. So what the filter does, it only lets through certain parts of the frequency spectrum, so you can remove the higher parts, the higher frequencies, or remove the lower frequencies, or have a kind of narrow band of frequencies that moves. So that's what's happening here. There's several different recordings with different filters all moving, which creates this kind of very slow movement out of these recordings taken at the different points in Suilven. So as the piece goes on, gradually more of the lower frequencies are emphasized. So the graph data that I talked about before being fed to the synthesizer is actually the contours of the slope going down from the summit. So I wanted to kind of create this impression of starting at the top of the mountain and moving out and around the summit and slowly descending. So one of the main processes in this piece is more or less the same as what was used in the Rain piece, so using resonators to transform the sound. But however, because the source material going into the resonator is quite different, it produces a very different effect. So in the first piece we had the kind of quite percussive, kind of pointillist rain sounds, whereas in this piece it's the wind, which doesn't have that kind of same percussive attack and has this kind of ebb and flow in terms of sound. So I used 8 resonators here. So if I just play the sounds, we can hear these different tones being generated by the resonator. So we have different recordings being sent to different resonators, so there's different tones and kind of sonic shapes going on, as well as different pitches being resulted. So as the wind kind of moves through these resonators, it emphasizes different notes in this kind of chord that's being built up. So it's essentially just one chord of 8 notes, but the wind and the different rates at which it's blowing through the different recordings alters how the notes are balanced in that chord. So we hear them all together. So that's just the resonators without hearing any of the recordings underneath. So another process that was used that becomes more prominent towards the end of the piece is called a granular delay. And that's used on those surface recordings that we heard at the very start, which is basically the very subtle movements in the moss surface. And I used the granular delay to expand the characteristics of these sounds, so keeping the essence of the original but expanding it in a kind of similar vein. So if we hear, so as we go on, we can hear these kind of those kind of very high frequency, kind of fizzy, crackling sounds on the top. So if we isolate that, so that's it without the effect. Still getting that kind of crackling. And we add the granular delay, and it's like kind of taking those tiny little pieces of sound, splits it up at different intervals of time and pitches, and then plays them back. So it takes all those little crackles and kind of reproduces and multiplies them, so kind of creating the illusion of the sound growing outwards from its original source. So that brings to a conclusion what I have to say about the pieces that came from the residency and my experience of the residency as a whole. Um, but before I go, I'd just like to say a quick thanks to Nigel Goldie, who oversaw and arranged the residency and has given so much of his time to developing the residency and the studio space over the past few years. It was a really great opportunity for me, and the studio is such a great resource for the community too. So I really hope there won't be too long before it can be used at its full potential again. Thanks also to Kat and Vicky and everyone else at Call who made the project such a success and were a really great help on the ground, especially with the workshops and getting those all organised. And thanks also to the teachers who came from Lochemver Primary and Ullapool Secondary Schools with the kids, who were a really great help, and also a big thanks to all those who participated in the workshops, both kids and adults alike. Um, this kind of activity really depends on the engagement of all those who participate. So they made it as much of a success as I did. So thanks so much to them for making it such a great experience for all of us. And finally, big thanks also to the Heritage Lottery Fund, who provided the funds to the Coyote and Ascent Living Landscape project, and made this residency and the resulting work possible. So thanks again for watching and listening. I'm really sorry I'm not able to come back and share the work in person with you all, but I'm really looking forward to whenever I'll be able to return to Ascent, whether that's in a professional capacity or otherwise, and seeing how the studio and the activity grows into the future. I hope you're all keeping as well as possible in these strange times, and I hope to see you all again sometime soon. Bye for now.